Does the Bible publishing industry change the Bible?
Editorial teams, people in charge of either publishing or making Bibles, can be very intentional about crafting the contents of the Bible in such a way to where they have a really like a culturally activistic agenda. They want to change things. It's not just about honestly rendering what's there. It's about wanting to guide the culture.
In this video, I talk with a leading sociologist, Professor Samuel Perry, about the subtle additions Bible publishers make to the text to influence how you interpret it. Welcome, Sam. Thanks for coming on the channel. You and I actually met a few years ago at a conference in Australia, and some of the things that you talked about, not actually in your talk, but at the end, just sort of as an aside, were some things that I was really interested in. Some things about study Bibles and the big business behind Bible translation and how those can influence the way people read texts. So I had a question for you. One of the things you talked about was the section headers that go in Bibles. So many people know that these section headers are not actually part of the original text, but you talked about the way that they prime readers to read the text in a certain way. Can you talk about how that works?
Yeah, so these things are inserted strategically by editorial committees and translation teams to try to give, and I hold giving them the benefit of the doubt here. I think they're trying to describe what they think the next section is about. But these are placed with intentionality, and they are phrased in such ways to where they give the reader an idea of what the editorial team thinks those things are about. So one example of this, and I think this one has relevance, is how Ephesians 5, say, is parsed up. So for example, you've got several translations, say the RSV is an example of that. I think the NIV does this as well, that they place the section header before verse 21, which says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. In Ephesians 5, right before verse 21, they give the section header. And in the RSV, it says something like the Christian household. And so it gives the idea, it gives the impression to the reader. If you put the section heading right there and you say the Christian household, well, this is what the Christian household is characterized by: mutual submission. Submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ, wives to your husbands, husbands in a way to your wives as Christ laid his life down for the church, and that kind of thing. The ESV, because of the editorial team that put that together, I think they with intentionality decided that they wanted to divide that at a different place. And so they include verse 21 in the previous section, and they start at verse 22, where it says, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. And the section header they put right before that is wives and husbands. And so with that, you can see how that makes a different meaning. So the reader looks at that and says, oh, this is a passage about wives and husbands and how they're relating to one another. It has nothing to do about mutual submission. It's about wives submitting and husbands leading. And so the impression is more of a complementarian understanding that wives are the ones submitting, not a mutual submission kind of idea. So this is just one example, but I think this is a part of the editorializing that goes on in the construction of English Bibles. A lot of people don't understand that what goes into our English Bible translations are the result of hundreds and hundreds of decisions made by human beings who I think are really trying to do their best to represent what they think the Bible says. But human beings are biased, and we have our own ideological biases, and some things we don't even recognize that we think. Other times it's quite intentional because we feel like this is the way it should do, and we want to actually plant a flag in the ground for our own interpretation of that biblical text. And the way we do that is by translation, arranging, study notes, headers, all those kinds of things.
And so the way that that sort of influences people, you sort of called it priming. Would you mind just explaining quickly what priming is for people who might not be familiar with the term? Yeah,
priming is a concept we use from social psychology. There's a whole branch of experimental psychology and some fields associated with that really are focused on how our brains, say, see various cues. They either read certain things or they see certain images, and it leads us automatically, unconsciously even, to think in a certain way, to track a certain way. So, for example, we just published a study that showed priming white Christian Americans to think about anti-Christian bias makes them also think about anti-white bias. Like that if you, in other words, if you tell a bunch of white American Christians that like Christians are being persecuted because they automatically kind of conflate race and religion in some really important ways, it also makes them feel like white people are under attack. And so if you are a savvy politician, you can prime white racial threat by just talking about Christian threats, right? Like, oh, it's Christians are being persecuted. Well, if you say that to a strategic audience, then you can make them think about like, oh, border walls and Black Lives Matter and racial riots and all those kinds of things. And so that's an example of priming. So a way you could do that in the Bible is with certain kinds of language and certain kinds of phrasing or headers or things like that to make people think a particular interpretation is more appropriate.
So it's fascinating to me, just by adding a few words, you can influence how people are supposed to read the text subconsciously.
Right. Well, and so I think here's another example of that. They maybe people who have studied the Bible for a long, long time have a nuanced understanding of what New Testament slavery might have been, or the kind of slavery that would have been represented in Paul and Peter's day. And so when they hear stuff about slaves in the New Testament, maybe they don't think antebellum slavery. They don't think the kind of slavery that took place in Europe and Brazil and the United States. They think that's just a certain kind of bond servant in a very nuanced theological sense. But a lot of Americans don't. And so knowing that, translators have at times taken intentional steps to get rid of that slave language and to translate it as something else completely so that people don't get those negative vibes from it. Like people don't think, oh, slaves, does the Bible endorse slavery? Slavery sounds horrible. And so if you can change that language, then you can avoid the negative connotations or the implications that come along with that. So again, it's just changing words in a minor way that more educated people may, I don't mean educated, but I just mean more informed or kind of in that subculture that understands the nuance of that. They might not feel that negativity, but if you're trying to make a good impression on a broader readership, it'd probably be best to get rid of all of those negative words. And translations do that. Like the English Standard Version is an example of that, how they systematically over time got rid of slave language to now they just say things like servant or bond.
And one of the other things you talked about was it's not just text in the Bible, like those section headings, but also can be text around the Bible. So study Bibles are a good example. And you had so many examples of different study Bibles that you had seen, and yours is a particularly US context. But what are some of the very niche study Bibles you were talking about?
Yeah, so on my shelf up here, I have a collection of various study Bibles, and they're all aligning my shelf over here. I've been kind of a collector and connoisseur of these things because I find them fascinating, the kinds of messages that they get put in. Actually, the phenomenon that we see in study Bibles is very old. So for nearly 1,000 years, Bible translators and people who construct Bibles have been putting in glosses that would put various not paraphrases, but they would put various notes and things next to the text about interpretation or about their various thoughts. And at times it got so bad that different committees and translation committees said, no more glosses. This is something that you're biasing the text in some way. In fact, the Geneva Bible, this very famous Bible that really was a foundation for the King James Bible later on. The Geneva Bible was famous for actually having lots and lots of marginal notes where they made interpretations for the reader. And so they would associate the Pope with the whore of Babylon or the dragon or the beast in Revelation and they would make various notes about royalty and that kind of thing. And so King James, when he initiated the King James version, the KJV that we know today, he actually knew that was a problem and said, like, hey, we're not going to do this kind of marginal notes. We're not going to put these glosses in there. We want to avoid those kinds of things. So the phenomenon of like sticking little notes and summaries and interpretations in the Bible text is something that is very, very old. But it's something that can have profound implications. One classic example of this would be the Scofield Reference Bible. So the Scofield Reference Bible happens around the turn of the century, around 1900. C.I. Scofield, he puts in all of these study notes and cross references in his Bible that he put together. And in that, he's interpreting all of these passages in light of premillennial dispensationalism. He's talking about like when the dispensations are. He's giving his premillennial eschatology. He's putting that in the text. And so because that becomes such a popular version of the Bible, it could be argued that C.I. Scofield in this study Bible, the Scofield Reference Bible, is one of the main factors that led to the explosion of premillennial dispensationalism in the United States. Not only just the conferences, not only all of the popularity of preachers from Dallas Theological Seminary, but the C.I. Scofield Reference Bible and all of its notes and study aids to help people interpret the text in this way led people to say like, well, okay, that must be, that's what my Bible says. It's in my Bible. It must have some authority. In other words, people probably wouldn't say that study note is the same authority as like the actual verse, but I think it's safe to say if you find it in your Bible, there's probably some trust that goes in there that says must have some credibility. These people know more than I do, obviously. So some other examples of that, though, this can go in both directions. This is why I find fascinating. So I've got lots of examples I could give here, but this is one kind of from the conservative end. This is called the Founder's Bible, put together by a guy named David Barton. So David Barton is a founder and leader of a group in the United States called Wall Builders. And basically the organization exists to provide, say, kind of Christian nationalist factoids for pastors and readers, supporting the idea that America is a Christian nation founded on biblical principles. Well, they have for years put out, a website, and he's gone to various churches and given talks. But a real quick way, if you want to just, get in people's hands beyond just having them buy your book, is to actually get a Bible in their hands. And this is chock full. Nearly every other page, it seems, with little articles that talk about how America's founders or great Americans throughout history used the Bible, and I would lead you to the conclusion that, of course, America is obviously a Christian nation. Therefore, we ought to vote that way. We ought to vote for candidates who promise to return us to our Christian heritage and that kind of thing. So it's an effort to, I think, slant people's reading in that regard. But this actually goes to the other. It takes place on the other side as well. So this is the New Testament and Psalms, an inclusive version, and this was put together and retranslated, really a retranslation of the NRSV by a group of scholars that wanted to make a more progressive, inclusive version of the Bible. One reason is they thought that actually reflected what the language said. So like, I don't want to just say that this was a completely biased move, that they really did feel like, okay, the language is supposed to be more inclusive. Men and women would have been in these communities. The language should account for that kind of thing. But in the preface to this, they are also trying to make they have an activist goal. They want to change language in a way. So here's what they said. This new inclusive version of the Bible not only reflects the newest scholarly work on the most reliable manuscript available, it also reflects attempts to anticipate developments in the English language with regard to specificity about a number of issues such as gender and race and physical disability. Bibles are widely read and therefore can serve to influence the development of important changes in language. Martin Luther's translation of the Bible into German spoken by common people in his country is an example of this. Luther's translation helped to develop and unify German as not only a spoken, but also a widely written language. And so what they're trying to do is they're saying like, look, we want to use inclusive language here because we also want to lead readers to use more inclusive language. We're anticipating these developments and we actually want to influence people in that way. And so these are just examples of like how editorial teams, people in charge of either publishing or making Bibles, can be very intentional about crafting the contents of the Bible in such a way to where they have a really like a culturally activistic agenda. They want to change things. It's not just about honestly rendering what's there. It's about wanting to guide the culture in a certain way towards certain conclusions, to guide readers. And, people can make their own, calls about whether or not that's an appropriate use of the Bible to do that kind of thing, but that's clearly what they're doing.
Exactly. Yeah, there were so many examples. I remember some of the ones you brought up. There's like a leadership Bible for people who want to learn to lead. There's the archaeologist study Bible, which like looks at creationism. There's the Patriots Bible, the American Patriots Bible.
Right.
So many different niche
Yeah.
Bibles. Yeah.
Well, and so this also gets into the, so, I mean, I think I've just given you some kind of cultural examples here, but this also gets into the role of markets in creating Bibles and disseminating Bibles. So it's not just about activists trying to influence the culture. The publishers want to sell Bibles. And so if they feel like there is a market for a particular Bible, so that you will have the Sportsman's Bible, the John Maxwell Leadership Bible, the woman's, homemaker study Bible, all of those different kinds of things, because you're trying to target a niche audience. If you go to crossway.com right now, or Zondervan, so either one of those are two very popular Bible publishers. Also, Thomas Nelson would be another example. And if you just go and look at the kinds of Bibles they distribute, you've got a niche Bible for every occasion, right? Like you've got children's Bibles, you've got Bibles that you can that are made beautifully because you just want a really pretty Bible with wide margins so that you can write little handwritten notes to yourself for posterity or maybe your children, or you can it has really neat designs and kind of artistry. It is a Bible for every kind of person, and that's not just the translation, which also gets translations are also conducted with an eye towards sales as well. So it's not just like the formatting, but the formatting and the niche versions of the Bible absolutely are done with an eye towards markets.
Yeah, that's fascinating. One thing I definitely want to ask you was, do you know how big the Bible translation / study Bible market is?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I've asked publishers these things before, and they are pretty tight-lipped about giving numbers to those things. They're not fans of saying, here's how many Bibles we sold last year. I think that's because that's probably that information would be shared with other publishers, and so people would have a pecking order of like where they are and how many Bibles get moved. But I will say, when you go to things like christianbook.com, or you go to Crossway or Zondervan, right up next to the best-selling Bibles are really things like pew Bibles with not a lot of like content in them. They're usually stripped down versions of Bibles that probably churches buy in bulk. And so they buy them in the hundreds, put in the pews, and they don't have a lot of notes or commentary in those things. But the next bestsellers are usually the study Bibles. I would wager that is what people are picking up for their personal study, because it's frankly, it's hard. I've been to seminary. I have an understanding of what's going on in the text just because of a lot of classes and a lot of work and a lot of study and a grasp of the languages. But if I didn't have those kinds of things, I would feel a little lost sometimes. Okay, what does this passage mean? That's hard. How do I put this together? How do I make sense of this? Well, let me go to a trusted source, the Charles C. Ryrie Study Bible, or the ESV Study Bible, or the NIV Study Bible, and I will go right down to the study notes and say, okay, you tell me what it says. Oh, that makes sense. And,
And going back to something you mentioned, translation is sometimes a market decision, a business decision.
Yep.
Yeah. What do you mean by that? And are there any examples that you're aware of?
Yeah. So I think there are actually a lot of examples. Some of them that intersect with textual criticism. Almost every New Testament scholar I've ever talked to is, and this includes the evangelical ones, understand that the woman caught in adultery in John 7:50-ish through 51 through 8:1, that passage should not be in John's gospel, that it doesn't belong there, that it was added later. Same thing with the longer ending of Mark. Maybe people are a little bit more dicey about the longer ending of Mark, but passages like that, Jesus sweating blood, people are usually New Testament scholars there's a consensus that those passages were added later. And yet those are some of the favorite passages of Americans, right? Like every movie I've ever seen about Jesus, every TV show, everything has the woman caught in adultery. He is without sin, cast the first stone. If you just removed that out of integrity's sake, well, that doesn't belong in the New Testament. People are getting the wrong idea. People are preaching sermons on that and reading that and saying, oh, I must do, if that is not the inspired autograph of John, then how do we justify that? Well, that they justify it by, if we got rid of that, that would not sell, right? Like nobody would want to buy that Bible. It would be panned. It would be a huge problem to remove Jesus sweating blood, the longer ending of Mark. It would be some kind of a liberal Bible. like you're slicing up the scriptures itself, even though New Testament scholars know those shouldn't belong there, but they leave them in there because that just feels right in your Bible. Translation decisions operate the same way. So, for example, in the Old Testament, Psalm 23, one of the most famous Psalms, probably. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Well, the consensus there is usually that's not a very good translation. That's a King James translation that we've repeated, but there's no valley of the shadow of death. It's probably even though I walk through the valley of deepest darkness or something like that. And yet we keep that phrasing because that is just what we're used to. Because culturally, it just feels right. Another one would be John 3:16. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believed in him would not perish but have eternal life. Well, the first part of that is a hutos, right? It's not for God so like intensely loved the world. It's thus this is how God loved the world. But if you were to change that to, for this is in this way God loved the world, right? Like if you were to butcher or retranslate John 3:16, people would have a huge problem with that. They would say, like, why did you mess that up? That's the best verse, and that's the most important verse in the gospel. So I have actually had for this project that I'm working on, I actually interviewed translators, Bible translators for this, just to think about how they make decisions. And I had them explicitly say this, that nobody would buy that book. We would get slammed by critics for making those kinds of choices. Even if that is the best translation choice or most accurately reflects what's going on, we would never be able to, to sell that kind of Bible. It's a market choice. It's what does the market want? Well, the market wants valley of the shadow of death and for God so loved the world, Jesus sweating blood. And even if those things don't necessarily belong there. And I don't mean to be so cynical here. Like I think, these folks probably had justifications for like those verses are part of tradition now. We expect those there. We put them in italics or we put them in brackets, which they do. Like, I don't mean to say, like, other than the King James, every translation that I know of puts those in brackets or double brackets. So they do call them out. And yet they're still there. And I don't know if the average reader knows what double brackets mean, or the italics or those kinds of things. So all that to say, the process of Bible production or the project of Bible production is more than just about finding the best manuscripts, following the best textual critical practices and the best translation choices. It is also about dealing with the history of a translation, the culture, the community that one wants to distribute those Bibles to. I think a good way to think about this is, and the book that I'll write coming from this research, I call the Jigsaw Bible. And the metaphor is a jigsaw puzzle. And this is actually a really popular metaphor among evangelicals in the United States. So Wayne Grudem, famous theologian and scholar, he uses this, and several other evangelicals use this idea that the Bible, putting the Bible together and making it into a coherent theological unit, is like putting together pieces of the jigsaw. And so this is a really common metaphor. Actually, I heard this one in seminary as well. And so it's like you're putting together a jigsaw, but you don't have a picture of what it's supposed to be like, and you don't have instructions. And so you're trying to put together pieces of this jigsaw puzzle, and you think you got a picture that works, but there are pieces that like just don't fit, and you're pushing them in, and or you've got pieces left over, and you don't know where they go, and that's really frustrating. And everybody making a coherent theology out of their Bible ends up with pieces left over or pieces in the box or pieces that don't quite fit. Well, I would extend that metaphor. That's a common metaphor. So I would extend that metaphor to say, what if you actually like one community of puzzle makers or puzzlers, people who put puzzles together. What if they actually just kind of fell in love with one image? Like they feel like they got the best image and they feel like this is the one we're supposed to have. Well, we often forget that the people putting together the puzzle are also the people who own the puzzle making factory, and so they can decide, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of these pieces that nobody likes, and we're going to round down these other pieces that don't seem to fit. You know what I mean? We're going to adjust the puzzle pieces in such a way as to where they say exactly what we wanted to say, or they make the image that we want to make. And what if we put instructions in the box to make sure that everybody who opens up our box of puzzle pieces knows exactly how they fit together. Do you see where I'm going with this metaphor? It's like
Yeah.
that's kind of
Yeah.
what study Bibles are supposed to do. It is, and that is the translation processes. People who have a vested interest in making sure that all those puzzle pieces show one image that they feel like is the right one, and so they craft that carefully, and then they put instructions in the box to make sure that like when you put that puzzle together, you're going to get the same image that they get. Which I feel like is really much of the project of Bible production, is making sure that oftentimes the Bible ends up saying what you want it to say, either because that's what the people demand that you're trying to sell to, or that's because that's the project that you're engaged in, as some kind of a culture warring effort.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen one of the Incredibles movies, but it kind of reminds me. He's doing math with his kid, and he's like, "But they changed math," and I feel like it's a bit like that. It's like, well, you changed the Bible. I'm not going to buy this Bible, even though a textual critic or a scholar might say like this is the better translation. If it's something that people are really attached to, it's just not going to sell, and so you can't do
Right.
it.
Well, and this, like scribes and people have been doing that for years. Like they would find and that is why we actually have textual criticism, is we go through and we have various rules when we do textual criticism. That is, the more difficult reading is probably the preferred one. Why do we follow that axiom? Well, it's because we understand that scribes, if they came across a difficult reading, one that made Jesus look mean or made him look human, they might be tempted to kind of mess with that and change it a little bit. It's one example of that has taken place recently is Mark 135 is kind of a good example. So Mark 135, the text for a long time we had as saying, and this is, most Bibles still say this, that Jesus looked at this this person that he had just healed and had compassion on him. The other version of this text, in which is also older versions of this of these older version manuscripts, says that Jesus was indignant with him, like he was annoyed with him, and it like actually makes Jesus look kind of short-tempered and impatient with him. There's really no reason somebody would have changed it to like Jesus was indignant with this guy, and so the NIV, the committee of the NIV, has come to the conclusion that that is probably what it says, and they changed their version, and they probably took heat for that, for making Jesus seem like, well, that's kind of rude, right? Like, that's, why would he be indignant with the guy? The guy just got healed. Why is he, impatient?
And you're right. It does happen in with ancient scribes as well. One of my favorite examples is the chronicler in the story of David and Goliath. There's another story of Elhanan killing Goliath, and most scholars think that that's probably the earlier story. It's been expanded into David's world, but the chronicler kind of covers over this contradiction of there being two Goliaths by saying that this little warrior Elhanan, he killed the brother of Goliath. And then what's even more interesting is that the NIV committee, when they've gone to translate the David and the Elhanan story in Samuel, which doesn't have the brother of Goliath, they've added the brother of Goliath in Samuel, where it doesn't belong, because I guess they've seen the chronicler do it, and they thought, well, we can do it as well.
That's right. Yeah. So I mean, it's like it's just because like humans are involved in the process, and so like did they do it nefariously or to be wicked? Probably not. They just felt like they were honoring the text in that way. And I want to I want to give these folks the benefit of the doubt. I think they really do feel like what they're doing is honoring their community, honoring the text, and I don't want to be so cynical as to think it's all just culture warring and money. It's not. I think people are doing their best, and yet it's okay to acknowledge that like the human side of this involves people with various biases and communities with various biases trying to make sure that the Bible is protected and the message is preserved. And so you can see that pretty obviously in the way they create a Bible for market.
I had a couple of quick final questions. Are you aware of, I mean, obviously like the study Bible market in the United States, I'm sure is huge.
Right.
Are you aware of whether that gets exported overseas, the same sort of practices?
I actually, I don't know enough about like what's happening overseas in study Bibles. I know that I think there is less controversy over the introduction of different versions of the Bible overseas than there is in the United States. But when we had, for example, in the 1990s, the New International Version started introducing inclusive language. And when I say inclusive, I just mean they, instead of saying brothers, they would say brothers and sisters, and just to include women in the translation, which Adelphoi appropriately is translated as, what just it's this the idea of kin or family. In the United States, there was a huge controversy of that. It actually led to the birth of the English Standard Version as a response to what they felt like was a feminist capturing of the beloved NIV. But in the UK, this had been sold for a long, long time, and they had no problem with it. It was something that they were already putting together, and they were moving. They had Zondervan had sold that for a long, long time, and so my guess is there is probably less of a need for the careful crafting and culture warring that goes on with Bibles in the United States that overseas. Part of it is because we have this kind of really strong evangelical Bible culture, and maybe overseas there just isn't as much of a isn't that much of a controversy over that. Yeah.
And I know I've seen some sort of people, when you've talked about study Bibles, people on Twitter have asked you, in your opinion, like, what do you look for? Something that's maybe less focused in, less niche.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I'm very much a part of a Christian community myself. Read the Bible, and I want to think rightly about these things. I wish that I think the evangelical Bible culture has developed several kind of buzzwords around Bibles that give the impression that they are trustworthy or reliable in a way that I feel like is not the best way to think about that. We use things like literalness or word for word, things that people don't really understand because that's not how translation works anyways. Like, no translation is word for word. And
yeah, I've seen those graphs, and they lay them out like, this is the more literal one, this is the
right.
Yeah. It's not.
I feel like it's misleading, and I wish people, but evangelicals especially, like Christians who say, I take my Bible really seriously, and I want to know that what I'm reading is as close as possible to what John the Apostle wrote. They hear literalness and word for word, and they feel like, okay, that is faithful, right? Like, that is a faithful translation. So I wish we would move away from that kind of language. I wish they would evaluate Bibles in a different way. And I think there are two criteria that I wish we would incorporate into that. One of those is accountability. So are the people translating and putting together this Bible accountable to anybody besides this like group of people who think exactly like them? In other words, have there been different voices in the room? Have they had to come to a ecumenical decision about the best translation there, and there was actually dissent, the possibility of dissent? So this for me, I think individual translations are fine for if you recognize them for what they are. Like, Tom Wright came out with his own Bible translation. Hart, came out with one. I think that's fun and interesting to read. Eugene Peterson's Message, like, those things are fine to read, but we acknowledge that like one guy did that, and we just know that that's their own kind of translation and version of those things. I think it gets a little bit trickier when you've got, say, something like the ESV, which is actually, it's, if you look at like Crossways, like who is involved in this, there appears to be a committee of people who are all just kind of a bunch of guys who are all part of the same religious community and theological tradition. They all agree the same. There's no women, there's nobody else in that community. And from what I understand, and this is from talking to people about this, the people that they got, the various kind of external readers that they got to sign off on this, were basically people who this kind of, gave they weren't involved in the process at all. So there wasn't a lot of accountability going on. Another way to do this, though, I think a group that has done this well is the NIV. So the NIV has a committee, the Committee on Bible Translation, that is not beholden to the publisher. So like the publisher, Zondervan, doesn't get to go in and be like, hey, that's never going to sell. You can't make that choice. The Committee on Bible Translation makes an academic decision about how they're going to go about like this translation, if they're going to make a TC decision or those kinds of things. And they have to get like so much support for it. They have to pitch the idea, and if they can get voted down, and and it's a diverse group. There's men and women, and there's people of color. And I feel like that is the example of like accountability that I want. That like choices that are made have to be made with some kind of like consensus, and there's the possibility of difference there. So I wish people who read their Bible, who wanted to pick a Bible. I think the Christian Standard Bible is actually another example of this. There's a woman on the committee. I think they have sought to get a little bit of diversity and retranslate. So that's formerly the Holman Christian Standard Bible, but it's now been revised as the Christian Standard Bible. So that's one example of like accountability. Another criteria that I wish people would go to would be the transparency about how the decisions were made. Like, is the impression that this committee of godly divines who don't have a name went to the mountain and came back with stone tablets and just what they got is that kind of, or do they actually talk about how choices were made, like how they evaluated certain things? The best example of this, I think, is the Net Bible. So the Net Bible, in my opinion, is not the best. Like, I don't necessarily like the choices that they made all the time. I don't, like sometimes the reading is kind of weird, and the choices that they made are kind of odd, but they have tons and tons of notes, and they are extensive, 60 plus thousand notes online that you can read right now that they've updated. And they go into the text critical problems, they go into the translation problems, and they talk about why they translated it that way. In the age of the internet, why don't we have that? Like, what is the reason why we wouldn't have that, other than just you feel like it's going to make your translation decision look more arbitrary rather than coming down straight from like the hand of God, which it did not do, right? Like, so like you had to make a choice about how you're going to translate that. So I would encourage anybody who is thinking about a Bible, and what is a good Bible. I hope they incorporate the criteria. I mean, if they want it to be paraphrasing and readable for like pleasure reading, that's awesome. If they want it to be really literal, like the NAS, that's awesome. That's great. The RSV, I think those are good Bible. But I wish they would incorporate the criteria of accountability, where the people who participated in that accountable to anybody else besides themselves, and is there transparency with how the decisions were made. And so I think those are good ones.
Yeah, and obviously,
I mean,
a lot of scholars prefer the NRSV because it's a diverse committee. There's
right.
It's not just evangelicals. There's Protestants, Catholics. There's Jewish scholars. There's men and women on the committee.
Right.
But I do wish it'd be great for them to release some of the notes and the decision making. Yeah,
right.
particularly like I know their new translation. Obviously they've had to change some things, and some of them are a little controversial, and you don't know why certain decisions were made. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I feel like that's in the age of the internet, I don't see why that wouldn't be doable online, at least. Maybe you can't have it in your big massive kind of like Bible version that you're putting in people's pews, but if you're going to put that on Bible Gateway, if you're going to put that online, why wouldn't we do that? In the social sciences where I work, there is a movement. We're a part of the open science movement. Like, we want to, because there is a crisis of legitimacy. There's a crisis of confidence in sciences. Like, we want people to know how we did what we did. Where are the data? Why did we do it? We want to make our data publicly available so that people can see those kinds of things. And we feel like we do that because that will breed trust in our conclusions, that we're accountable. Like, that we can't fudge stuff, that we can't hide what we did. We made the data available. You can look at it. You can see what we did, all those kinds of things. And I don't see why Bible committees would not be obligated to the same kind of standards of transparency, especially when it's something so important that people build their lives on.
I guess before we wrap up, are there any other things, I guess, on sort of, modern ways people influence changing how the text is read that you think that we haven't covered?
I think time will tell whether or not we're still running experiments now, and we want to get into this, like how much the actual phrasing of a passage shapes people's interpretations versus what they bring to the text. So we all bring ideological biases and kind of commitments and things that we want to see in the text, and I think the jury is still out on how much of what I see in the text am I responding to because the phrasing was a little bit different. We have some evidence that people, if they read something completely different, say like in Ephesians 5, for example, we ran a study about this, like how much of the text would we have to change for people to come to a different conclusion about what Paul meant by wives submitting or those kinds of things. versus just like what they already bring ideologically to the text. Do people just see what they want to see, no matter what the Bible text says? And what are the limits of that? Like what combination of ideology plus kind of interpretation is going on there? I think that's a fascinating question that needs to be developed more. Because if it really is about, I mean, take for example, we did a survey, a national survey where we asked people which version of the Bible they used most often, and we found that when we looked at all of the versions of the Bible that people used, and we looked at who they voted for in the United States, like in the 2016 election, this was fascinating because we found that the group most likely to vote for Trump was ESV users, English Standard Version users, and the people most likely to vote for Clinton in that election to be Democrats were RSV, so like Revised Standard Versions. Now, why that's interesting is because those are the two versions that are almost exactly alike. The ESV is only ESV is like 96% RSV. They just changed like some different things here and there. So you basically got people on the polar opposite side of the political spectrum using pretty much exactly the same Bible with the exception of a few things. So to what extent is the Bible really switching people's like political partisan leanings? Maybe not. I mean, maybe people are just kind of taking what they want out of that, and it's more about community applied interpretation there. Honestly, the questions seem endless to me, and so I think there's lots of room for research and fun questions to be asked. But that's just one of them.
Well, if people want to follow your research, where are the best places for them to keep up with you?
So you can the only social media I'm on is Twitter, and I refuse to call it X, so I will call it Twitter until the day I die or leave, or it all crashes down. And so I am at Prof. Sam Perry, and so you can follow me there. And so I tweet a lot of data, a lot of studies, a lot of things that we're finding. And I've got a book coming out called Religion for Realists: Why We All Need the Scientific Study of Religion, and it comes out with Oxford this summer, 2024.
Oh, beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Sam, for taking the time and sharing your expertise. I've learned so much, and I hope my audience has learned a lot too. Thank you so much.
My privilege. Yep, thank you.
If you enjoyed this video, consider supporting the channel on Patreon or becoming a channel member. It really helps make these videos possible. My name's Lachlan, and you've been watching Tablets and Temples, where we unpack ancient history and religion. And I will see you in the next one.